update, because we always talk about construction stuff.
That's right. It's always a start, right?
I just realized the common thread, right? So like, I want to hear about yours, but ours, right? So for everyone that's watching, I know that's why you're tuning in today, is for our construction update. So like 10 months ago when we came out to visit you, Chris, right? Like we had our water heater explode in our house in Idaho. And so anyway, they tore it apart. I mean, it was $50,000 worth of damage. Chris, they just finished yesterday. They just finished doing all the floors. They had to do the floors through the entire bottom of our first floor, and they just finished. And it's funny because all this week I've been like on calls with like my co-founders, and they're like, Terrence, does that not drive you crazy? I'm like, what are you talking about? They can hear all this noise in the background. I was like, I'm just used to it now, but it's all done. So from 10 months ago when I came out there to today, it's all done.
Well, we were lucky. We weren't expecting to be done with our construction until Thanksgiving, and we finished 3 weeks ahead of schedule.
Wow.
Now it's all moving everybody in and moving things around and getting rid of couches that are 20 years old and all that good stuff.
We're doing the same thing. Isn't that funny how that happens?
Yep. Yep.
Well, should we kick things off a few minutes earlier, or should we?
We can.
David, hold on. David, do you have any construction issues that you'd like to bring up?
No, I wish. No, so the biggest thing is just like Chris, people coming to clean the yard at the most inconvenient moments, just like making noise outside.
Yeah. It's always landscapers always show up when you're on the most important call of the day.
It's like they know. They just like
mine come today. They come outside because my home office here is outside it, and they come in the afternoon typically. But you know what's going to happen? They're going to come now.
Oh yeah.
I just, as soon as you said that, David, I'm like,
no, it's like they have a radar for like, am I taking an important meeting? And then if so, then they're outside with the leaf blower.
Yeah,
exactly.
Karma. Some bad, good. What do you think? Should we wait a few more minutes? What time is it? We got a couple more minutes till we officially go live.
Yeah, it's almost top of the hour. I think we're live already, so I guess we can get started whenever you guys want.
Yeah. Let's kick in. All right. So Chris, you know the first questions that I'm going to ask you. How many is this? What is this? We've done this consistently for probably once a month for however many months, and we've done a few. What number is this? Would you be?
We are on number 5.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, we are on number 5. We're actually like on a 3-week cycle now, which is really cool. We were going to do another one next week, but we pushed it out till after Thanksgiving because it takes a couple of weeks to get these things scheduled appropriately.
There's work to it, right? We just don't look this good and just show up and talk about stuff. There's pre-meetings and there's meetings before those meetings. It's like
exactly. And in this case, we got a really, really good turnout, so I'm really, really happy about it. And to give everybody time to sign up.
Yep.
So this is our 5th one. This is our 2nd one in the series of data. If our audience remembers, we had a Stop Hating Your Data LinkedIn Live a couple weeks back, which was really well received. So we decided we'd dive a little bit deeper and start talking about data storytelling today. One of the comments we did get was that there was a lot of elderly, gray-haired people on the camera this time. So we asked David to join us this time to kind of round out the aesthetic, so to speak. So David, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to join us today. And we are going to start talking about data and storytelling.
Yeah. So let me kind of kick things off. I hear storytelling and I instantly go back to my youth, which was a long time ago, given my gray hair. Right. But what is it? Like, what is data-driven storytelling anyway? And, how does it even relate or apply to healthcare? So let's just kind of start with that.
Yeah, I'll start at a broad level, right? And you kind of hinted at some of it there, that data-driven storytelling is an evolution of something that we all know, which is how we tell stories, right? The reality of how we communicate is that we often do that in a business setting. We do so to communicate a point and to get somebody to understand and either agree or do something that we need them to do, right? So as a company or as an organization, you typically want others to understand something that you're getting to them. And in the healthcare world, it's typically arranging so that we can achieve better outcomes, either on the business side or on the sort of provider side as well. From a data storytelling perspective, it's sort of the natural evolution of that moving forward, where storytelling traditionally is a very sort of linear and very one-sided affair, where data-driven storytelling is sort of the natural evolution of that, as I said, where you take information and you use it as evidence to drive your point in a sort of iterative fashion, if that makes sense.
And the interesting thing is, you would think data only tells one story. Well, that's really not the case. Data is interpretive, just like everything else. So the story is interpreted by the people who are looking at it. So there are things you need to do in order to make sure that the data tells the right story to the right people at the right time. And when it comes to healthcare, it's really interesting because, again, the goal for healthcare always is improving patient outcomes, whether you're working on the payer side or the provider side, and that's the goal. And because there are discrete values in healthcare, especially when you're talking about patient monitoring and patient vitals and things like that, you really hope that there's a single story thread that goes through there. But again, it's all within the tools that you use in the lens that you're looking through, and that's why it's so critical. Because in healthcare, you only want one story and one outcome. You want the best outcome for the patient, but you need to make sure that the data is telling it correctly. So, for example, if you're doing remote patient monitoring, you want to make sure that the tools that you're using and the data that you're providing and the data that you're gathering in order to improve the process actually goes in the right direction and tells the right story.
Yeah, and we'll touch on some of this later today, I'm sure. But the biggest point that I want to hit on is something that you, Chris, just brought up, is that in data-driven storytelling, unlike traditional storytelling, the story is in the eye of the beholder, right? In the sense of, one of the things that we try to prioritize as practitioners in data-driven storytelling is for democratizing the data. And why we overuse that term sometimes, but what we mean by that is that we want the people enjoying and sort of taking in the story to be able to understand the message in their own way. What is a challenge in traditional storytelling is ensuring that everybody understands the story the same way. What we tweak that into in data-driven storytelling is allowing everybody to interpret the story slightly different ways with the same data set, so that they arrive at the same place on their own volition, as opposed to us trying to convince them of something by itself.
Fair point. So why don't we start with the high level, traditional versus data-driven storytelling? David, why don't you start with that?
Sure thing. So yeah, like I mentioned earlier, right, the main differences are primarily the sort of one-way versus the interactive nature, like we were hinting at earlier, right? In traditional storytelling, you have a sort of one-sided relationship with the audience, where you, as the storyteller, are really driving the narrative. You're setting the story, you're trying to get a point across. And so you structure the way that you're sharing information in a way that doesn't allow the user to interact, or the listener to participate in either the crafting of the story or the narrative, or in drawing conclusions from it, right? Like, you're trying to get somebody to understand something, and then they take whatever lesson you're trying to give them, and that's it. In interactive or data-driven storytelling methodology, you're trying to get feedback from the audience, and you're trying to get them to provide sort of inputs that then evolve the message as you're going along, where you, as the storyteller, sort of participate, or you interact in creating the message that you get to at the end. Does that make sense?
Totally. Now, the interesting point of view here, and we're going to probably have this common theme throughout the live event today, is interpretation and conversation and what's the goal. Ultimately, I was at I think my first data conference. It's over 10 years ago now. Oh my God. And I was listening to one of the speakers, and what I gleaned from that was this little thing: data brings information, information brings knowledge, and knowledge brings wisdom. And that's all great. And if you look at it visually, we'll have a visual slide later, but look at it visually, it's kind of like a pyramid. Data's on the bottom layer, and then you've got knowledge, and you've got wisdom. Well, the anecdote there is that take a whole lot of data to get a little bit of wisdom, but that wisdom hopefully is the same across everybody's view. Now, the challenge here is that data is driven by multiple end users. It's driven by the business. It's driven by the consumer. It's driven by IT. And as we've learned in many, many ways, they all look at things differently. IT will define something differently than a business person might. and you got to make sure that overall that level of storytelling is level set so that it's not misinterpreted.
Yeah, I think one of the critical things, right, and you and I have talked about this before, is that data is the connective tissue between business and IT in many ways, in the sense of sort of mending that relationship where there's a disconnect in terms of understanding each other and what you need to get to. The evidence, the data itself, is what brings those two parties together in understanding or getting to a same outcome, right? That's why from a strategy perspective, it's really critical that storytelling is clear and it moves towards a sort of common path, so that from a general strategy perspective, you can bring the business together and help them communicate what they need to IT, and IT can help bring that to reality by taking whatever requests came in and sort of using that as a guide. And in particular, we talked about this earlier as well, but in the healthcare industry in particular, there's sort of an intrinsic need for data storytelling and for merging those two worlds as well, in the sense of healthcare is a really data-driven industry, whether or not it's, I guess, intrinsically forward-looking or innovative. There's always a component of data around it, just like there is in like finance, for example. So being sort of fluent and being able to navigate those that world of knowing what to do with your data is a critical component of what we do.
Very fair. And let's give some hypotheticals here if we could. So ultimately, David, we were talking earlier and you were telling me some examples of, how you present the data and how that makes a difference essentially with there's a question, will it be available on demand? And the answer is yes. This will be on LinkedIn, posted after this, and you can review this content at any time. Thank you for that question. David, why don't you give it a hypothetical about, again, like how you present things to a C-suite person, regardless of different than you would present them to perhaps a layman.
Yeah, I think that obviously the audience of your story changes what the message is. Obviously, you would not communicate to a C-suite engagement or person the same way that you would to a layman, and you certainly would want to structure the story in a different way. Sorry, I think everybody is frozen right now. I don't know if we should just suggest that everybody refresh their page, maybe.
We're not frozen on our side.
Mm-mm.
Okay, yeah, I just saw the comments pop up, so I wanted to call it out. So in any case, the situation is that from a storytelling perspective, right, what you want to achieve is communicating to the right audience. So when we typically, when we do data-driven storytelling at a leadership level, what we want to do is allow the leadership to contextualize the data at the level that they want to see fit, right? So when we build dashboards and when we build reports or stories in general, what we want to allow them is to navigate the data at the level that they need to make the decisions that they want. The biggest challenge when we typically work in the healthcare world is ensuring that people have access to the right data at the right time, but also that they're able to make the right decisions with that data and that they're able to trust what they're seeing. From a storytelling perspective, building trust in the strength of the sort of underlying evidence is the biggest challenge that we face. So from a reporting upwards, if you will, versus reporting downwards sort of perspective, it's all the same in the sense of you want the people that you're reporting to at a C-suite level to trust that what you're giving them to make decisions is appropriate and sort of concise and in the right space. But you also want the people using that data or at the lower level sort of engaging with the data to trust that the data is telling them what is actually happening in reality, right? So there's sort of a disconnect at both ends where, people that are using that data to make decisions at a very strategic level often don't trust it. And people that are using it at a very granular level often don't trust how it ties to reality.
How it's interpreted.
Yeah. So our job as storytellers is to connect those two dots and bring those two worlds together so that, the message that is coming from the granular level is getting to a strategic level at a sort of validated perspective.
And that's really interesting. And we've just started another engagement helping to optimize some data-driven analytics. And, as you can tell, this goes from the batch processing and the data ingestion and all the data manipulation and all the data reporting. And I was talking to one of the directors yesterday, and I said to her, I said, listen, if you had a magic wand, what are the top 3 things you would want to solve? Let's start with your wish list. And she goes, well, let's start with data and reporting accuracy. And I was like, whoa, that's big. There's many tentacles to that. And I said, first of all, if your data's not accurate, your reporting's not going to be accurate. So it's kind of 2 different things. And she said, well, it's kind of the same thing. I said, a little bit, but we really dove deep into that. But the interesting thing there that we got to is there's also the same data can be delivered differently, and therefore the story changes. So for example, in a lot of the programs that our customers do, they'll do just pure data extracts, and they'll provide data extracts to their clients and their consumers. And then everybody can take that data and interpret it any which way they want. This is pure data, and hopefully everybody at least agrees that data has been well defined, is reliable, is predictable. Now, then you take that a step up and you go into quality reporting, or you go into your KPIs, and you have third-party vendors that are potentially adding data that gets merged to it, and you have other groups like your quality reporting team or your data analytics teams going in there and adjusting them, and therefore is the outcome still the same? So, everyone's saying, oh, our extracts are fine, but our quality reporting is off. And how do you make sure that all those steps in the process, third-party vendors, batch processing, reporting layers that are put on top of it, still tell the same story, or still tell the accurate story? The worst thing that you can do is have extract data that says one thing, and then you can have quality reporting that says something else. So this is where the challenges are in how you define them, how you roll them out, how you train them, and how you understand your user base.
Yeah, one thing I want to add on that point, right, is as anybody that has ever tried to build a report in the healthcare world will know, telling stories with data is a culture change, in the sense of getting a large group of people in any industry really to agree on how to tell a story about something is a challenge. And in the healthcare world, as I said, it's an issue of trust in your data and trust in what you're seeing. That the things that you understand about how you do your work make sense and align with the way that you are saying those things and communicating them to your bosses and your bosses' bosses. The challenge from a culture perspective is to sort of tap into something that you and Costa talked about in the last podcast, which is sort of data literacy and a data-driven culture, right? Where the understanding of leveraging that data and how to use it for a perspective of communicating with others and to use it as a driver of evidence and to build that trust should be something intrinsic within any organization. And that's what we try to strive for as people, as advisors, right? As we try to say or set that world of data is not just a tool in and of itself. It's something that you use as a sort of conduit to a better way of interacting with and doing or making decisions rather.
Yeah. I think I've told this story before, but I mean, it was to your culture change point. When you start the data the road down data lineage, and you've got to do your data definitions, and you've got to get everybody in healthcare to agree how you define a particular value. Where are we going to get this particular value? Because this one system may report it one way, this system may report it another way. Whichever one you choose is going to change the outcome. And luckily, the CEO and dean of this one place where I used to work was fantastic at making his chairs understand that, hey, this is the data. You're going to use my data, not your data. Go fix your reports and use my data and come back to me. But don't tell me that my reports are wrong because you want to use a different data element. And that took some time, but he was strong enough and drove it enough to make it very successful.
Yeah. So one interesting thing, right, is that from a narrative perspective, the truth about data is that as long as it's correct and properly sort of buttressed by like a infrastructure that can be verified and qualified, the data is the data, right? Like the story is the sort of framing around it that you give it as a person because you have a sort of motive and try to achieve a purpose. But the numbers are interpreted in a way that is that should be consistent across everybody, right? That's the whole point, is that we want to achieve a world where everybody in an organization and in the healthcare industry is addressing the reality of what the data says in an appropriate way. So we want to react in a way that is consistent with what the information around us is telling us, whether or not that fits the narrative that we've set for ourselves. That's really the difference in reality between traditional storytelling, where, as I said before, we want to drive a narrative, and data-driven, where we're trying to drive an expression of what reality is showing us.
Dave, I have a question for you. I think, part of it is that we start, kind of like you said, at the 30,000-foot view and kind of move in. Let's move into like a deeper dive, here. And when I look at some of the best processes and procedures, they're repeatable, right? And they have different steps and different stages that they move through. Does that, approach and methodology also work here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the same way that you would structure essentially anything else, we've kind of defined the structure of data-driven storytelling versus traditional in sort of a parallel view, right? I'll share my screen actually to share with you guys a view that we've created to kind of explain this. But the idea being that traditional storytelling and data-driven storytelling live in parallel worlds, and hopefully you guys can see the graphic.
Yep,
we're good.
So the way this works is that essentially, every story, whether it's traditional or data-driven, starts and ends the same way, right? You have a purpose that you want to achieve on the left side on the start, and then you have communicated that successfully at the end. Whether that's traditional or data-driven, the sort of journey has the same beginnings and ends because you're trying to use this tool to communicate and get somebody to understand something. The difference is that, as I said before, from a traditional standpoint, right, you want to have sort of a controlled narrative where you define what the path is and what the sort of journey is to getting from beginning to end. And then in a data-driven world, you sort of go to the top path where you have an iterative or cyclical sort of perspective in interacting with the audience, modifying your perspective and what you thought the message was, or sort of getting to a more evolved place, and then affecting behavior change in somebody via that data. So as I was talking about before, I'll go through these in a second and more in detail, but the key is that in data-driven storytelling, what we want to achieve is behavior change, right? We want to achieve people seeing the reality for what the data is telling them and being able to modify and make decisions in an informed way based on that, as opposed to a set narrative that we want to affect. Does that make sense?
Totally. So why don't you run through this, and then we can follow up with some specific questions, because I see this as, I love the growth and the iterative approach, but I see that being multi-dimensioned also. There's this initial iterative process, and then there's the linear one. As you get more mature in your organization, you need to go back and review that and actually might change some of your approaches.
Yeah, so I'll start at the bottom, right? And so what I'd like to do is I'll sort of walk through the whole traditional storytelling curve, and then I'll go back and compare what the sort of data-driven equivalent is of that same point.
Sounds good.
So in a traditional story, right, what we do is we have an idea that we want to communicate. That's the first step, really. What you have is a sense of where you want to get to from a directional perspective, and you sort of know where you're headed with your story. So what you do is to start to set up that idea, right? You want to take what you want to communicate, and you start to build those building blocks or those foundations for how to understand what your message is. So from if I'm telling you a story perspective, I would just give you sort of set the stage for you, if you will. I give you the boundaries of what the story is. And then from there, I just try to get you to understand what the action is, right? Like, what is the same way, or what are we doing about the thing that I told you was a problem? What are we doing about the foundation that I just laid out for you? And if you're noticing, this sort of follows the same structure as movies or TV. It's the same thing, right? Exactly. Where you're setting up a universe, you have something that you want to communicate, you sort of set the stage for people, and then suddenly things start happening, right? Or things start kind of developing in the story via the action. That action then has an effect, where the effect is, I set up X world for you, Y happened, and as a result, Z was the sort of knock-on effect of that. Right. From there, you sort of start to see the directional or linear directional relationship between the things that I set up for you and then the things that happened as a result, where you end at the impact. Right. So how was the world changed by what I told you? We were in this first place. These things happened. And as a result, we ended up in this other place. You'll notice that in that sort of linear progression, you don't participate in that at all. right? What happens is that you heard a story, something was told to you, and you just absorbed it and sort of learned a moral from it, but you didn't really either provide feedback, you didn't certainly change the course of the story in any way. You were sort of set, or if you were in a roller coaster, to give you an analogy, you were just on the roller coaster and you just went up and down. And you went from not knowing something to presumably being slightly more knowledgeable about something, but not really having a deep understanding of what went on there. Does that make sense?
Yep, exactly right.
Then from a data-driven perspective, obviously there's a parallel to each of those steps that we like to sort of modify so that the process is more interactive and back and forth. Similar to what you would do in a science experiment, right? The first step of a data-driven story is a hypothesis. What we want to do is use the data to verify a suspicion we have about the world. This is true in healthcare, certainly, and also true in any other industry in the world, right? Any data-driven story starts with an idea that is validated by data, right? That's why we call it a hypothesis, is because it has to be provable and it has to be sort of replicable in the same way that an experiment would. So from there, we gather the evidence that helps drive that hypothesis and helps us understand whether or not the hypothesis may be true. The reality of it, right, is that unlike in traditional storytelling, where we don't really need evidence of what we're saying, we can just say anything. In data-driven storytelling, what we want is for the hypothesis to be, as I said, replicable, and for others to be able to understand and take what they're seeing into their own hands and make it themselves. So the evidence needs to be there for us to drive the narrative that we're building from the beginning into sort of that circular motion in the center, where we talk about growth and iteration. This is the biggest difference in data-driven storytelling versus traditional, where before the action sort of drives the narrative from the setup that you give the audience. In data-driven storytelling, the growth of the audience interacting with that data, giving you feedback, and then you modifying that the data set or report or dashboard or whatever it is in an iterative way, makes it better and it makes it stronger in terms of the case, because it takes people's feedback, it takes people's sort of experience in understanding your message and in kind of getting what you want to get at and building into it a stronger case, right? It sort of, as the storyteller, it gives you feedback of perspectives that you don't often consider. One of the biggest sort of blinders that we have as storytellers in healthcare and otherwise is that we only tend to consider our perspective and our understanding of how we perceive the data or how we perceive the case. What we find in a professional context is that people understand information in different ways and certainly react to it in different ways. And integrating those perspectives and those reactions into how we tell the stories is what makes them stronger.
Exactly right. Keep going. No, please keep going.
No, I mean, I was just going to add that, like, to close out sort of the cycle, right? The reason we want those perspectives to be built in and to be sort of blended into the line is that we want to show value, right? In a traditional story, it's all about effect. It's all about what changed. In a data-driven story, what we want to show is here's how your life changed meaningfully and why, right? What we want to show is not just we went from A to B, is we went from A to B and we achieved X% increase in value, or we achieved, for example, in some of the examples you gave before, we achieved X% improvement in member outcomes or something like that.
Member outcomes, exactly.
Or we saved X% in, revenue or profit or whatever, or we achieved X% profit more. Like, basically you're providing data points that give you credence to what you were sort of iterating before in that cycle of, I have an idea or I have a hypothesis, I'm going to validate it, and then I'm going to use everybody's perspective or my audience's perspective to grow it. Now I've demonstrated via that there is value in what I'm saying and that I can affect change via that, which is the last step, right? It sort of builds all in and of itself, and naturally bringing together the provable hypothesis along with the evidence that supports it, and then the audience feedback to kind of build on it. Intrinsically, the value becomes clear and people understand that and affect their behavior to modify based on it, right? So if you see something, a hypothesis, right, that you all suspected, because typically a hypothesis is based on something that many people see, and you understand the data shows that you should go a different way as a user of that data, and somebody is telling you a story based on or supported by evidence that can move you in a different direction, naturally you're going to want to go that way. So from a behavior change standpoint, we want to affect that as well. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and it goes back to what we said at the beginning. Data brings information, information brings knowledge, and knowledge brings wisdom. The wisdom is the behavior change. And again, if the data is driving in the wrong direction, you need to change the direction of the outcome, so of the impact, so that you can improve on the data. It's especially in healthcare, and we've said this already, is the whole goal is member or patient improve their outcomes, make their lives easier, make their drive down costs, which is a benefit for us all, but ultimately achieve better outcomes for everybody. And that's where the wisdom or the behavior change comes from.
Yeah, I think to give a concrete example of it, right? The last time in the last podcast, you guys talked about health equity and social determinants of health data.
Yep.
So that's a very good example of this, right? Where data and data-driven storytelling can be a good driver for affecting behavior change in people. What we know is that we can use data to better understand social determinants of health, and we can use data to better understand the social components of how people live their lives and how it affects their health and just general health outcomes. And telling stories via that data is how we understand broader trends in population sets that may have collective sort of behaviors or collective trends that we can then use to affect better change, right? Either at a payer or provider level. It's really just a matter of effect or understanding what we have at our hands and using that to collectively tell cohesive stories about population groups that we can help affect positive change into.
Exactly. And it's the same thing, for a lot of our clients, especially in these worlds where they're providing data. It's providing data to providers or to ACOs or even to specialty vendors that do this work that will ultimately show ways to improve overall care. So again, when it's the ACOs, they manage the patient's data. They have a population they need to manage. They have a certain risk that they're managing to the population, and this data helps drive their ongoing management of them. But then you got these specialty providers, or you got remote monitoring devices, and they actually are telling stories as well. How do you help manage kidney care? How do you do diabetes management? All these remote monitoring devices that can ultimately tell the end user a story, a day-to-day story. Oh, wait a second. Your device is saying this today. What is it telling us? What should you do? How can you change your life? How can you impact the outcome? And how can you adjust? I mean, that's a very powerful story. And this is where, we can talk about AI. We always end up talking about AI a little bit, but this is where AI can help impact it, as they can build upon the data and improve the story and understand the outcomes better. It ultimately can have real impact in somebody's life. Let's take a simple example of somebody who uses a pulsometer. They have a bad reading one day and they feel it. They can't breathe properly. They're having challenges with their oxygen intake. Well, typically they might just run to the emergency room. Well, with some very basic interaction from some devices and some data storytelling, we can say, wait a second, this is what your reading is this. This is what you should do right now. Did this help improve your outcome? If not, now this is your next step. And that is, again, hugely beneficial to patients' daily outcomes of their health.
Yeah. So something I want to highlight on that you just called out, and you kind of, a light bulb sort of went off in my head as well, is that people think of traditional storytelling as only taking one form, which is me telling you something or me giving you a report. And the new world of storytelling and data-driven storytelling, the story takes many forms. And the reality of where we are now is that we are inundated by data from everywhere. So as you said, the medium or the media by which you get your story can change actually quite significantly depending on who you are and what you're interacting with, even in the healthcare world, right? So you have wearables today that give you a significant amount of data. You have, reporting, traditional reporting. You have dashboarding. You have certainly any number of media that you can use to interact with the data and affect change. So the thing that I want to highlight here is that it's important as we move forward as an industry to think a little outside the box in how we both capture but also share data via those stories, right? There are many ways to affect change that are not, especially in a business context, that are not giving somebody an Excel spreadsheet with numbers in it.
And there's the converse side to that is also alert exhaustion. So the good news now is we can take data and do automation, and automation can alert people, and we can send alerts for this and alerts for that. But at some point, what is the right level of contact? What is the right level of data? What is the right level of interaction before it becomes too much? So that takes everybody. That takes, so the IT people, the data-driven people can help automate, and they can help alert, and they can help monitor. The business people, the clinicians, the care managers can help them determine what is the right interaction with the end user. How much of the story do they need to have, and how often do they need to hear the story in order to be impactful?
Yeah, and we'll touch on some of this in a second, right? But the main thing is, and sorry for stealing our thunder, knowing your audience, knowing who you want to hit, is critical, because understanding the world that they live in and how they're taking in the information is the important part for how you build that sort of iterative cycle that I was talking about earlier.
Well, and I'll kind of jump in there, right? So a lot of this is giving me flashbacks to creative writing class that I took in college, and as
101, right?
Yeah, 101, right? I mean, literally, and I'm like, okay, like, how do we go about building the narrative in this storytelling process, right? Like, and I don't know if this is a Chris or David question, but like, what are some of the tactics, techniques, and best practices where you can implement, what we've talked about so far in this building of the narrative?
Yeah, I'll reiterate that point that I just made before, and something that you brought up is actually important, which is this in particular, knowing your audience is something that is true of any story in any setting, right? So the creative writing sort of bit, it's kind of a joke, but it's also not, in the sense of those frames of creative writing and sort of how they pursue storytelling have a very powerful lesson, the same way that we would apply it in the healthcare world, which is when you write a story in a creative setting, you still want to communicate something, and you still have to know your audience, and that you have a target that you want to communicate to. And when people write TV shows, or when they write movies, they write with target audiences in mind, the same way that we would whenever we create a report, or we create a sort of intrinsic method of like communicating information. So we have to take that into consideration, right? It's like, what do the people that we want to communicate with want to hear? What do they need? What do they even know? You would not communicate the same way to somebody that knows nothing about data, or that knows nothing about what you're trying to tell them, the same way that you would to somebody that's a significant expert at something, right? Just because there's levels of complexity built in. And there's a really cool YouTube video series where it's like somebody talking to the same or talking about the same concept at 5 different levels of complexity in like one video. So you have somebody sort of go through 5 different people that have different levels of understanding of the same topic, and then they go through and sort of explain a very complicated concept to like a child, and then a teenager, and so forth, until like a PhD expert. And you sort of get the sense of this lesson, which is knowing how to communicate to every specific person in a way that relates to them and that gets them to understand what you're trying to say is the key. Because if they don't understand, then you failed as a storyteller and as a communicator.
So what are you saying, David? It all goes back to data literacy then.
Yes, correct.
At the end of the day, you got to simplify your complexity. I mean, data, if nothing else, there is more data and more data and more data coming all the time. There is not a limit to how much data sources there are, how many data interpretations there are. But how do you eat a rhino? One bite at a time. You got to take the steps to break down the complexity, to use visual aids, use clear language to make sure that everybody understands at the level that they need to understand it. And obviously you're going to improve upon it as you go. There, and the second part of that is you want to structure the story. The story can't be freeform. Especially in the data world, it can't be. Creative writing is unfortunately a little too broad for what we're talking about, but this isn't technical writing either. It lives somewhere in between the worlds of the two, and it's not so cut and dry as technical writing and not so free form as creative writing, but you got to structure the story enough so that it makes sense to the audience and becomes ultimately what the goal is, to become actionable. If all these stories aren't actionable, then they're just stories, and then what do they do at the end of the day?
Yeah, from a complexity perspective, definitely, right? Like, we don't want to over communicate either, in the sense of giving somebody a story for its own sake is not understanding the tool for what it is. Storytelling is a tool to communicate and to share. So if we're not sharing and somebody doesn't feel like we shared with them, then we did not succeed as storytellers. One of the best things that, from a data vis standpoint, so I'm a big data vis evangelist and sort of really enjoy different types of data visualizations in general. One of the things that I really love about the data visualization community and data storytelling community in general is that we tend to share a lot. We tend to be very collaborative and want to share with others what we found and what we built. So I would encourage all of you to, as you sort of navigate this topic more, to get out there in those spaces and like learn more from people that do data vis and that do data storytelling. I'll share some links in the chat or in the comments after the session as well with some of the stuff I've referenced. But from a perspective of complexity and structuring the story, as Chris was saying, certainly having a clear message in your head and a clear hypothesis of what you want to show others and how you want to approach that, and then focusing on having that message or that structure in a way that makes the impact actionable to the user and to the listener or audience is the key point, right? I want to make sure that we stress that, such that learning from others and learning or seeing it in action is the best way to get better at communicating via data. And inspiring or getting inspired via the way that others do that successfully is the important part, because seeing how others are making data actionable is the reality of what we do. This is hard, right? It's a skill that you need to build over time to be able to convince others of what you want to get to via evidence and via data. And seeing the many different ways that there's very creative people out there that are presenting data across every industry in the world, and certainly in healthcare, is the only way to get better at it.
Exactly. All right, we reached the portion of our show where we got to talk about the challenges. We told about all the ways to do it right.
Yes.
But, obviously things don't go according to plan most times. So why don't you run through some challenges, Dave, and I'll jump in as well.
Yeah, we sort of hinted at it at one of the biggest ones earlier, right? Which is bridging the world between IT and business is a major, major challenge of data-driven storytelling in the real world. The biggest disconnect that we see is that there's sort of a directional or purpose challenge between IT organizations and business organizations in how they tell stories and what they want to say. So what we want to do is enable the business to understand the world that they need to make a strategic change, and for IT to be able to feel confident that the data that they're providing or the infrastructure that they're providing to build the evidence for that case is strong and is consistent, like I mentioned earlier. What we often see is that there's not alignment between those two, right? There's a heavy focus on evidence from an IT perspective, and there's a heavy focus on moving a business case forward from the business perspective, but there's not a connection between the two in sort of bringing that infrastructure or that foundation for making the case in the first place. So bringing those two groups into a metaphorical room and having that discussion about, what do we really have from an evidence perspective, and what can we really make happen, and how can we really, enable that cycle that we talked about earlier of data-driven storytelling, in reality, understanding the real constraints that real businesses face, right? Like the reality of most healthcare organizations, and especially smaller healthcare organizations, is that there's a limited amount of data that's available to them. And the quality of that data is also limited. So the real constraints that they face are like, how do we do the most for what we have? And how do we tell effective stories with it, right? Like, we have to be able to trust it. And in this sense, having something, a little bit of data that you trust and can refer to is better than having a lot of data that you don't trust.
That is constantly being questioned. Exactly.
And to another point that you made earlier, from a literacy perspective, right? The other challenge is that there needs to be buy-in from your entire organization for how you're going to use that data. So from a healthcare perspective, because of that lack of trust, there is often, and this is essentially true in every organization that we work with, there is a lack of trust in the data. And as a result, there is a lack of trust in telling stories with your data. If you don't trust it, you don't trust what you're saying. And if you don't trust what you're saying, your audience will not trust the message that you're trying to get across from them or to them.
And Terrence, I can't believe it, but we're 42 minutes into this and we haven't used the word governance once yet.
So I'm going to use it now.
There you see, typically in every one of our LinkedIn Lives, governance is key, and we've actually got almost 3/4 of the way and haven't mentioned.
I'm impressed, guys. Good for you guys. I appreciate you made it this long without mentioning that big word.
Well, I'm gonna ruin the streak. So governance,
go for it.
Yeah, governance is the key, right? You guys, you and Costa talked about it earlier in the previous session as well. But governance as a data construct is the foundation for how you feel trust in your data. If you don't have the foundations, if you don't have the processes or guidelines that will set the boundaries for your data being clean, your data being concise, and your data being in the right place at the right time, you will not have what you need to move forward on telling strong stories. So whenever we pursue this sort of work with clients, what we often have to do is take a step back, right? Because I think people often want to jump to how do we communicate? How do we get people to know what we want them to do? The reality of it is that is step like 3 or 4. Step 1 is, do we even have what we need to tell that story? Step 2 is like, is it ready in terms of being used on an active basis? Step 3 is, what is it going to take to build it? Step 4 is telling the story. So more often than not, people are sort of jumping ahead to telling the story when the key is, do we have the governance program in place to support the data that will then support that story?
And that goes even further. So there's a governance in exactly what you said, which I fully 100% support. But there's also the governance and the buy-in from senior leadership that this is an investment. So for example, a lot of our clients, they're not just IT and not just the business generating the data, generating the reports, but they're actually supporting their end users by providing insights to the data to their clients. Because again, you can send extracts, you can send quality reports, you can send data out. If it's not ingested properly, or if not or they don't have the infrastructure themselves to really interpret it, maybe they need help. Let's take an ACO again. They're dealing with a lot of payers. They're not just single threaded. So if you can help them understand where the data is coming from specifically in your organization, they can sometimes cross that over into their entire practice and make those same types of interpretation. But that's an investment. That takes time, people, energy, money, all those types of things. But that investment goes to the ultimate goal of member and patient outcomes.
Yeah, I think that the key is that from a literacy standpoint, right, and from a data-driven culture standpoint, there needs to be leadership buy-in to this. Always. That's the only way this gets sort of enabled in reality, is that to tell stories with data and to have that effect, there must be buy-in at the leadership level in order for the rest of the organization to feel comfortable in using it in the first place.
Exactly. All right, we got about 10 minutes left. Why don't we just talk about some real world cases? David, once you start, I'll jump in after. Some lessons learned, things like that, and then we can sum up and take any questions.
Yeah, like we talked about earlier, right? There's certainly a lot of use cases for how to tell stories in a healthcare setting and use data to do so. So, I'll go step by step, right? From a payer perspective, there's certainly an opportunity to maximize outcomes for payers and sort of how they manage their members and their population in general, in the sense of data allows you to optimize. So understanding that to its fullest degree and to an actionable degree allows you to optimize in a way that improves outcomes, that improves sort of financial results, that improves compliance. There's a series of sort of benefits to really understanding the data, in that those hypotheses that we talked about, you can build and sort of think of and validate via them. That's really the primary benefit, is that you can trust the data to tell you where your organization is headed from a payer perspective, and see the trends and trust the trends that allow you to change course as needed.
The other important thing I find, and it's just interesting again, sometimes the world's a little cyclic, and you start out a project, and a couple years go by, you get pulled back in, and you realize that things change over time. So processes that you did, and this is a huge lesson. So don't think that just because you solved it 3 years ago that it maintains its same definition 3 years later. I mean, first of all, data changes. First of all, perspective changes, outcome changes, the reality of the world around us changes. And so it has to be an ongoing optimizations. And that's where, again, the governments and leadership this is an investment. We're not solving a problem once. We're probably solving the problem multiple times over the course of many years. And hopefully each time getting to a better level of storytelling, learning from what we've done in the past, improving upon it, but maybe because of new data that's come out or a new way to interpret or new government rules or whatever, it changes the course and the outcome and the action. So that lesson there is huge, because a lot of people think that, it's kind of like that project versus product mentality. A lot of people in our world think, I'm a project manager, I run a project, it has a start and a finish. Well, if it's a product, there is no start and finish. There's a start and there's an ongoing, and data should be viewed as a product.
Yeah, and then from a provider lens, right, the main outcome that they want to achieve usually and try to use their data for is to provide better outcomes for patients, for people that need services provided. So the key is to use the data at that sense to sort of directionally change the way that patients are interacted with, certainly. And then from a data perspective, what we see in the market is that understanding sort of macro trends of not how a specific patient necessarily is handled or is managed, but rather how groups are. And so how certain trends that providers are trying to follow and certain areas that they may be lacking in can be addressed.
All right, we got a few more minutes left. Open it up to any questions if there are any out there. Otherwise, we'll just do our conclusion and call to action here. I mean, again, this is a very important topic as we move forward. We're all inundated with data all the time, and it gets exhausting. It's got to be actionable. It's got to be efficient. But it's got to be done intelligently, and there's got to be the cooperation through all the different talents that need to make it happen. David, why don't you bring us home on this?
Yeah, so just kind of summarize and bring it full circle from earlier into to kind of take my own advice. The need for contextualizing different data differently for different stakeholders is the key here. So understanding the sort of approach that we talked through earlier, where the iterative cyclical approach is the way forward in terms of how to use data for telling stories. You take a hypothesis that you have about how you want to communicate something, you validate it via the stakeholders by understanding what they need, and then you use the data as a driver of evidence for affecting change in those people. So understanding how you want them to change and understanding what it's going to take for them to change is the critical part of this. And I want to stress that experiencing different ways or different forms of data storytelling and experiencing different media that this storytelling is driven by is the sort of key of how we move forward as an industry in this space.
Excellent. And let's just wrap it up with, obviously David alluded to this too, and we'll put some links into the chat towards the end, but, go out and connect on LinkedIn, connect in communities, connect at events. We're only going to get better collectively here. This shouldn't be a sideload topic. We learn from each other in the giant GitHub of the world, so to speak. Join different user groups, join different events, connect on LinkedIn, reach out. Feel free to reach out to our partners over at XLHCA or Healthcare Associates or Rhyno Healthcare, and we can help guide you as well. But ultimately, this is a really important topic for all of us, because it's just going to grow. The amount of data out there just can continue to grow, and it can continue to be more relevant and important to the outcomes of the people that need it.
Yeah, I wish I had my little QR code that I had prepped for the call, and it got messed up. So I apologize. But yeah, like Chris said, if any of you would like to reach out and learn more, happy to always discuss more in detail. Feel free to reach out via LinkedIn, and like Chris mentioned, I will leave a comment in the notes for this event, I guess, so you all can see and reference some of the things that I talked about, with some links to some of those places and some of the resources that I think will be useful for driving some of this, in addition to that graphic that we showcased earlier with the sort of two-pronged approach. But yeah, like Chris said, also, continuing to engage with this and continuing to get better at it, or do it, is the only way to get better at it, rather. So I would encourage you all to take a chance, right? Like, try to tell a story with your data and try to put yourself out there in terms of how you creatively try to communicate a message. And then, as the approach says, just iterate. That's all it's about.
Iterate and iterate.
Well,
Terrence, what do you miss, Terrence?
No, you guys, and you mentioned it, Chris, like, I just appreciate you guys doing this, right? Because it's not about, some call to action that's selling something. Like, you guys are taking time out of your respective days to help, foster this information and have these discussions that are helpful within, the healthcare community and IT. And, as always, I appreciate it. I'll get the number right at some time. Next time's going to be number 7. But, and luckily we're doing this on LinkedIn, so everyone can connect with you guys individually. But just the whole point of this is just to foster these conversations that can be helpful to the community. And I just appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. So with that, we'll look forward to number 7 in a few weeks, I guess. Chris, you want to?
Yep. As always, we want to thank the audience for joining us on a Friday. We find it just is a nice way to wrap up the week. We hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving the next couple of weeks, and we'll do one early December.
I love it. All right, guys. Thanks so much again. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.
Have a great day, everybody. Have a great weekend.